The biggest fire of the century has appeared in Russia. The Ukrainian army has signed a major operation within the borders of Russia. Exactly 29 months after the start of the war, the capital Moscow was bombed by Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft. Are the S-400 air defense systems that Russian President Vladimir Putin has praised not working? How did Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft enter Moscow airspace without intercepting Russian air defense systems? After this operation organized by the Ukrainian army, Russian citizens began to leave the country. We know that during the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian military carried out airstrikes on Ukrainian territory. The unmanned combat aircraft and long-range missiles that Russia has been using since the first months of the war are pushing Ukraine very hard. As the duration of the war extends, we see that the violence of the war continues to increase. The Russian army continues its occupation of the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Kherson regions in Ukraine. However, the fact that the Ukrainian army launched a ground operation by entering the borders of Russia on August 6th has become a topic of the agenda all over the world. After the Ukrainian army first entered the territory of Russia's Belgorod, Russia's entry into the territory of Kursk, which is of great importance as a strategy, led to a red alert being issued in the Kremlin. As it is known, the Ukrainian army has been conducting operations within the borders of Russia for weeks. These operations, which included volunteer Chechen soldiers and soldiers of the pro-Ukrainian Legion of Freedom, began to make noise all over the world. The fact that the Ukrainian army advanced so quickly on the territory of Kursk and achieved great success made Vladimir Putin quite nervous. It is known that the Ukrainian army has now captured more than 92 residential areas within the borders of Kursk. The Russian general Valery Gerasimov has already begun to recruit Russian volunteers to stop the Ukrainian army's advance in the Kursk region. Since there are not many soldiers left to fight in the Russian army, the Kursk regional governor encourages Russian citizens to voluntarily join these military units. These volunteer Russian soldiers will be used to stop the Ukrainian army's advance on Kursk and evacuate Russian citizens living in the area. While all these events were happening, the Ukrainian army conducted another major operation with unmanned combat aircraft inside the borders of Russia. However, this time the Ukrainian army targeted 15 different regions in Russia with exactly 158 unmanned combat aircraft. This airstrike has gone down in history as one of the largest air operations that Ukraine has organized so far. The real bad news for Russia is that the Ukrainian army has blown up the oil refinery in the capital Moscow along with this air operation. When the fires caused by the destruction of the oil refinery reached the capital Moscow, Russian citizens began to leave the country. Along with the air operation launched by the Ukrainian army against Russia, explosions and fires occurred at 2 different power plants. Especially the explosions and fires that occurred in the capital Moscow and the border regions made the people of the region very nervous. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that 158 Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft targeting Moscow and its surroundings, as well as the Belgorod and Kursk borders, were shot down overnight. However, the explosions and fires that have occurred in the region say the opposite. The fact that Ukraine organized such an operation in the midst of the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine caused Vladimir Putin to take a big hit. Russian government officials said that 158 unmanned combat aircraft were shot down in 15 regions, 2 of them in the capital Moscow, and a major Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft attack was thwarted. The Ministry of Defense said in a statement that the vast majority of unmanned combat aircraft were shot down over the Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, and Belgorod regions. The number of unmanned combat aircraft shot down in these 4 regions was announced as 122. However, the Russian government has acknowledged that these unmanned combat aircraft have also hit oil refineries within the city limits. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin announced that there was a fire at an oil refinery in the capital Moscow after this attack organized by Ukraine. At least 11 Ukrainian UAVs targeted the capital and surrounding areas, Sobyanin noted. Soon after, it was learned that Russian citizens began to leave the country, especially the capital Moscow. According to information obtained from regional sources, These explosions and fires in Moscow and other Russian cities have led to damage to the trust of the Russian people in Vladimir Putin. With the war now spilling over into Russia's borders, Russian citizens began to think that Vladimir Putin could not ensure Russia's border security. In the first months of the war, explosions and fires occurred from time to time within the borders of Russia. However, the number of these events that have occurred in Russia in the last 4 weeks has increased 4 times. In many video images that you have also seen from social media platforms, we see that the Ukrainian army has started targeting inside the borders of Russia. This causes Russian citizens to leave the country. We already know that hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have left the country due to partial mobilization. These Russian citizens, who did not want to join the army under the coercion of Vladimir Putin and did not want to fight in Ukraine, managed to escape the mobilization decision by leaving the country. Now, Russian citizens who want to ensure their own safety have begun to leave the country. According to the first information obtained from regional sources, thousands of Russian citizens are said to have left Moscow or even left the country, because the Ukrainian army is targeting not only Moscow, but also multiple regions. Explosions are said to have occurred even near the Konakovo power plant, located in the Tver region, which is 120 kilometers from Moscow. Russian media also shared reports that a fire had broken out at this facility. Regional Governor Igor Rudenya made statements that the fire that started in the region as a result of a drone attack in the Konakovsky district was brought under control. However, he did not give any explanation as to where he was shot. Local officials said that the Kashira power plant in Moskva was also targeted. However, it was stated that there was no fire, damage, or loss of life as a result of this. BBC Verify, the BBC's verification service, reviewed these videos posted on social media, showing explosions in all 3 different regions, and confirmed these explosions. The images clearly showed that there were fires at the Konakovo power plant and the Moscow refinery. The Ukrainian army has increased the number of air operations it has organized inside the borders of Russia in recent weeks. The Ukrainian army, which has now started targeting Russian army headquarters inside the borders of Ukraine instead of Russian army headquarters inside the borders of Ukraine, seems to have made a major strategic change. According to a report on the BBC's website, Ukrainian officials stated that Russia carried out an attack on a grain convoy in the Sumy region late at night. It was stated that a truck caught fire and 20 trucks were damaged, 1 person was killed, and 4 people were injured in this attack. In the same way, Russia continues its airstrikes against Ukrainian territory. After the ground and air operations organized by the Ukrainian army within the borders of Russia, the Russian army has also increased its attacks. According to the BBC, the Ukrainian Air Force has successfully destroyed 8 of the 11 inauthentic warplanes sent by Russia. It was stated that these unmanned combat aircraft targeted grain and agricultural facilities in the Mykolaiv region. However, it is said that the Ukrainian army prevented the attack by destroying these UAVs. The Ukrainian military recently made it clear that they have taken control of an area of 1294 square kilometers. The Ukrainian army, which continues to advance within the borders of Kursk, is pushing back Russian forces in the region. At the same time, it was announced that 600 Russian soldiers were captured in these operations. Recently, 115 of these soldiers were released in a prisoner swap. While the Ukrainian army continues to advance within the borders of Russia, the occupation forces continue to advance within the borders of Donetsk. The Russian army, which continues to control the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar, has now launched an offensive against the Pokrovsk region, which is under the control of the Ukrainian army. The occupation forces that have entered the borders of Pokrovsk are trying to advance here. Since the Pokrovsk region is home to an important railway station, it is strategically a very important region for Ukraine. It can also be said that Ukraine uses this region as a logistics center. The Russian army is currently trying to prevent the Ukrainian army from organizing military shipments by seizing shipping routes in Ukraine. In the same way, the Ukrainian army is trying to prevent Russia from organizing military shipments by destroying shipping routes and bridges in the Kursk region. Belarus has taken action on the side of Russia. With this move, many countries have reacted harshly to Belarus. The movement of Belarusian soldiers towards the borders of Ukraine has stunned the whole world. Despite the possibility of a possible new war in the region, Poland's statements would change everything. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army began to take the lead in many ways. On the basis of these, the successes achieved against the Russian army were now directly making themselves felt in Russia. The fact that the opposition groups in Russia have big question marks against Putin's moves has caused all the advantages to be gained related to the process to turn in favor of the Ukrainian army. And at this point, the policies followed by Belarus may be the call for a new regional war. The problems experienced by the Russian army in the Ukrainian region have been found since the war began. Although many of the relevant political changes in war strategies have been based on this, things have now entered a completely volatile new period. Although it is not yet possible to predict exactly what Putin will do about this, the predictions have always been that the Russian army will fall back. This was also cited as the main reason why the victories to be achieved in the regional sense turned in favor of the Ukrainian army. But at this point, Putin was aware of the problems that the Russian military was experiencing in the Ukrainian region. Because of this, he began to make a great effort to actively show himself of the advantages that will be obtained. At this point, one of Putin's most important plans was revealed before Kursk. Belarus has been a country that has shown full commitment to Russia's policies since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The friendly relationship that Putin established with Lukashenko had clearly manifested itself even during the Wagner coup process. The fact that Belarus behaves as a puppet of Russia, regardless of the current administration, has also begun to drag things towards a different point. The main reason for this was that Ukraine took many steps directly aimed at winning victory. Putin, who also had to face the regional problems in Russia, was completely cornered after the Kursk operation. Since there have been no attacks on its borders within the framework of the occupation so far, the propaganda it constantly expressed to the public has also begun to move towards a different dimension. This, in turn, was of a nature that would lead to the emergence of more important dynamics in many ways. But what happened just before Kursk would have made it clear that Putin's plans for Belarus were actually considered from a completely different angle. The current troubles of Russia have started to move towards a different point day by day. An important factor in this was the unsuccessful outcome of the raids in Ukraine and the revelation of many problems in the region. Even the fact that Putin has made some such unsuccessful moves has paved the way for him to realize how problematic things are heading towards. The main purpose of the Russian army persistently sending a large number of troops to the region, claiming that it would protect Belarus, became completely clear after a while. Russian soldiers in Belarus had been sent to that region to be the key to direct entry into Ukraine. Along with this final route to Kiev, Putin's main goal was also revealed by satellite images sent by Israel to Ukraine. While this clearly shows that Belarus is of great geopolitical importance, it has also led to the allegation that Putin is using Belarus as an apparatus for attacks on this region. Faced with such great desperation against the Ukrainian army, Putin even needed support from Belarus. But the data that comes out about this will change everything. It is now known by documented that Belarus has transported a large number of ammunition to the Ukrainian border. Supporting the Russian side of the war can be described as directly supporting the war situation at the moment. This event, which will also greatly hinder Russia's dominance in the region, is now seen as the basis for a completely different axis of the process from a regional point of view. As a result of combining this kind of structure with other advantages that will be obtained, although Putin thinks he can defend Kursk, the statements made by the U.S. Treasury Department regarding the numerous countries that support Russia in general make it clear that Belarus does not expect a good process at all. But at this point, the truth about the ammunition being sent to the border is big enough to confuse the whole world. It is a well-known fact that Putin does not have good relations with Poland from a regional point of view. Many problems in the region have also been triggered by these, and Poland's position next to Ukraine in the region continues to increase tensions between the two sides. The fact that many basic dynamics in the region have changed completely in favor of the Ukrainian army is seen as one of the elements that helped things shift in a different direction. It is of great importance that opponents of Putin also make many statements based on this event, reminding them that confronting Poland is confronting NATO. The main purpose of these munitions sent to the Ukrainian border is the withdrawal of Ukraine directly from Kursk. It is of great importance that the current military troubles in Kursk are shifted to a different point by frightening the Ukrainian army. Kursk, which is claimed that such a structure will also cause it to evolve towards bigger problems in the future, is also hosting a major crisis in terms of its basic dynamics, but it is also a very important information that this kind of bluff will not stop the Ukrainian army. In addition, one of the main ideas is that the ammunition and supplies sent to the Ukrainian border actually represent an operation that does not exist from a strategic point of view. But despite this, the newly published embargo plan of the United States in response to the Russian army's chance to gain a possible advantage shows everything in the clearest way. The U.S. Treasury Department has recently realized that the harshest effects of the war have not been fully felt in Russia. Although many embargoes have been imposed on Russia, it is believed that there is also a financial force behind Putin's ability to continue the war. At this point, the investigations have revealed that Russia has received support from its allies in many dynamic changes in the region. The most general resources that the Russian army needs right now, such as ammunition and money, are provided by Russia's most important ally, and this ally was China, whose name we have heard before. And the latest statements made about China will also make it clear that things are moving to a different point. When the Chinese leader decided to visit Russia, this was described as a harbinger of a big problem. In this process, where Russia's commercial activities are currently suffering great damage, the possible assistance of a trade giant such as China was able to drag things towards a different process. The fact that numerous allegations were also made that Putin signed a secret ammunition agreement during this meeting would actually be seen as the basis for a much bigger problem. When the U.S. announced the embargo package shortly after this visit, in fact, the agreement on ammunition was also understood by the West. And the process suddenly had to enter a new era against China. On August 23rd, the U.S. Treasury Department announced that it would impose sanctions on companies and individuals found to be helping Moscow continue the war. The list included about 400 companies and individuals from Russia and third countries. There was also the possibility that the sanctions to be imposed on them would start a new period that would go up to the termination of their commercial activities. At this point, the fact that a significant part of the companies on the list were connected to China or Chinese companies made it clear how the United States reacted after this visit. From a regional point of view, the way for Russia to receive the slightest possible assistance would now be completely closed with this incident. Even before that, Western countries had completely prevented Moscow's comprehensive invasion attempt against Ukraine by resetting budget revenues and even accessing basic technologies thanks to embargoes. This has been recorded as another important element that will show that all the possible advantages to be obtained from a regional point of view are now in favor of Ukraine. But at this point, the most important of the embargoes was to show that Russia was completely cornered this time. More than 60 technology and defense companies linked to Russia are the companies that have suffered the most damage from the embargo at this point. This event, which will cause many dynamics in the region to change, signaled that things had completely changed. It is thought that such a structure will also prevent new problems that will arise in the coming processes. In other words, Russia's operations may be damaged enough to come to a complete standstill in the recent period. After Kursk, it's time to move to Belgorod. The Kremlin is completely stunned by the impact of this latest step. Who will the Kremlin administration, which claims that Kursk was entered because of Lapin's mistake, lay the blame on this time? With the declaration of an emergency in Belgorod, everything is completely confused now. In the last days of the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army has entered a period when it is using all the advantages it has now. The main reason for this was that all kinds of materials obtained after the Kursk operation would form the basis of larger operations. For the Ukrainian army, which had also begun to make bigger moves against the Russian army from a regional point of view, the process would move towards a completely volatile period. All kinds of problems in Russia have now come to a completely different point. As a result of these advantages gained against the Russian army and the very clear loss of Kursk, everything was beginning to turn in favor of the Ukrainian army. It was not a coincidence that some bigger crises were triggered in many ways as a result of Putin losing all the advantages he held in the region one by one, but there were many reasons why Kursk was lost in such a short time. The most important of these was Belgorod, which allowed the triggering of all operations in the Ukrainian region instead of Kursk. Lapin's critical mistakes, who thought that this would be the main target, have shown themselves at this point. But the Ukrainian army laid the foundations for a much bigger operation together with Kursk. Kursk was recorded as the most important offensive operation of the Ukrainian army, but the biggest reason for this was that it was the first operation to enter Russia's borders. This operation was also shown as the basis for a large number of successes that Ukraine, which has started making offensive moves from defense, will achieve against Russia if this process continues. As a result of the research conducted, it turned out that Kursk was both within the borders of Russia and that it could not be fully defended due to a very big mistake. Lapin had issued back-to-back resolutions some time ago in order for the Russian army to be more interested in the defense in Belgorod and not in Kursk. One of them was a critical mistake, such as the dissolution of the council at Kursk. The soldiers in Kursk were gradually sent to Belgorod, and after that, the information that the Ukrainian army was sending a large number of soldiers towards Kursk had not reached the Russian center. Although the intelligence had been obtained, the intelligence officials who thought that Kursk would not be attacked had not made the slightest mention about this incident, and the fact that the strategies were still focused on Belgorod brought with it a big defeat. According to the latest statements, the Ukrainian army had entered approximately 1,300 square kilometers and liberated more than 100 settlements. The Russian military, which tried to send a large number of troops to this region, did not fully realize how much Ukraine was focused on an organized operation. At this point, Ukraine starting to cut off future support to the Russian army and blowing up the bridges known as ponton bridges would bring about greater confusion in all areas. Besides the fact that Putin has suffered such big defeats against Ukraine, his sending troops on the offensive towards Donetsk, instead of taking precautions in the region, would still be seen as the basis for the loss in Belgorod. The Russian Defense Ministry announced in a statement that it had shot down 18 unmanned aerial vehicles by its air defense forces during the night. These unmanned aerial vehicles were also among those estimated to be hunting for intelligence before the deconfliction to the region. The shelling on Vatutina Street in Belgorod was an important example of this. Things got completely confused during the clashes in the Kupiansk region as well. The clashes in Sinkivka, Myasozharivka, Stepova Novoselivka, Kolesnikivka, and Lozova were the most basic sign that the process would be quite harsh as at the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army, which began to actively use the advantages obtained at this point, began to move towards the 2 points in Belgorod against the Russian army. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov announced that about 20 unmanned aerial vehicles had been shot down in the last 24 hours. According to Russian sources, clashes are continuing as Ukrainian troops are about to cross the border in the Belgorod region. This is of a nature that will cause Ukraine to show one of the points where it has a direct advantage over Russia. It is precisely at this point that the Ukrainian army has moved to take a bigger step, and Russia's process in Kursk would turn into a great despair with this event. But the allegations made about Iran were of a nature that would change everything. Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine Syrsky, in his recent statements, stated that the Ukrainian Defense Forces and the Ukrainian Defense Forces have advanced up to 2 kilometers in the direction of Pokrovsk and gained control over an area of 5 square kilometers. Besides, the knowledge that the progress on the Kursk issue was continuing would now be recorded as another important fact that showed itself. But despite this, the superiority of the Ukrainian army over the Russian army contributed significantly to the solution of many problems related to the process. At this point, a critical fact about the Russian army was revealed. The allegations that Iranian officers are training Russian soldiers in the Ukrainian region have stunned the whole world. This step by Iran, which would directly affect the course of the war, would cause a bigger crisis to be triggered in all areas. And at this point, Iran made a statement directly. The relationship between Iran and Russia has been quite close since the beginning of the war. The most important reason for this was that they were both countries that were embargoed by the West. These two countries, called the cornerstone of the Eastern Bloc, were also taking strategic steps together from a regional point of view. But at this point, there was a big problem. According to his claim, Iran had not helped the Russian army since the beginning of the war. The complete refutation of this with some evidence and the use of shaded model unmanned aerial vehicles by Russia in every operation was also recorded as the most important indicator. But besides this, the fact that a large number of achievements were achieved in favor of the Ukrainian army showed that the support provided by Iran was not very important. In this last case, the developments were completely different. Aware that Iran's possible political moves will also show itself, Ukraine also stated that Iran was a supporter of war in this incident after statements that Iran was providing training. At this point, Iran expressed that it does not support the Russian army by immediately making statements because it is afraid of being subjected to numerous embargoes. A spokesman for the Iranian foreign minister has contradicted the claim that an Iranian officer was in Ukraine to train Russian forces, and he called it baseless. These baseless allegations are being put forward with specific political motivations and contradict Iran's approach, he said immediately after. This would go down on the record as one of the clearest statements that Iran is actually gradually leaving Russia alone. Another important factor that changed things was that the policies pursued against the Russian army were moving towards a clearer point. Putin's aggressive attitudes in the region had begun to move to a point that would disturb not only one country, but many countries. This, in many ways, had caused bigger problems to rise as well. Exactly what the Russian army, which does not receive sufficient support in foreign policy, will do cannot be determined. This would go on record as another important element indicating that many basic dynamics in the region have completely turned in favor of the Ukrainian army. And exactly at this point, the statements made were of a nature to confuse everything. It was quite clear that Russia was facing similar problems with regard to China. Instead of supporting Russia, China was in favor of being on the same front as the West. Although there are many reasons for this, the fact that Putin's aggressive policies were actually likely to evolve into bigger problems in the future was a largely important element. The fact that the steps to be taken against the Russian army were carefully chosen by the United States was also enough to open the doors of a volatile period related to the process. The comments made by the war analysts about this would largely indicate the winds of change. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army had a dynamic that could establish significant advantages over the Russian army. In addition, the Ukrainian army, which also revealed that things were leaning towards a different point regionally, now had a basic dynamic that could also make bigger moves in all areas. The fact that Russia is not in a position to respond to this has completely changed everything. How big even these troubles that Putin is now experiencing from a basic point of view, combined with some big problems, were also qualified to be seen as the cornerstone of a major crisis in terms of the statements given. And this was considered the beginning of a new process in which things have completely changed.